Without further ado, our speaker for today will be talking on Can Modern Society Survive Computers? Dr. David Erbach.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I would have to say that I think that this club is one of the really nice features of this campus, where it's one of not too many cases where the students seem prepared to invite people with a variety of ideas, maybe even mathematicians or computer scientists, to come to speak. The topic here, I suspect, I don't know the exact history, but I suspect arose because several years ago, the university, as part of its Speakers Bureau project, circulated us, as it occasionally did, and said, what topics would you give talks on if external organizations were interested and someone asks us for a faculty reference? So I gave this title, and then promptly forgot about it. Last fall, I suspect that ex-President Misty was busy trolling the site of these things, came across the title and thought, well, maybe this would be interesting. So she approached me, and my response, of course, was, I'm not an anthropologist. I have no training whatsoever in it. If I had my undergraduate career to do over again, I'm quite confident I would have done anthropology instead of chemistry, which I did do as a kind of side subject, but too late. And she assured me that it didn't really matter that I didn't know what I was talking about. So normally academics don't get that kind of leeway, and I hope you will grant me the benefit of the doubt. The first question that I have to ask is whether the title of this talk can possibly mean anything. After all, it strikes me that there are more or less two possibilities. One is that we succeed in muddling through. We muddle through the financial crisis, we muddle through North Korea having nuclear weapons, we muddle through whatever struggles there may between fanatic and moderate Islam, and we survive the way we always have. So in that case, it would be clear that by definition, modern society has survived perfectly well. And of course, if we don't manage to muddle through and something pretty terrible happens, well, it wouldn't be the first time in the world. And there is no doubt, for instance, that whatever emerges on the other side will think of itself as being modern society, and they'll think of us as being, well, possibly life before the French Revolution or something like that. One way or the other, modern society kind of has to survive by definition. On the other hand, I still would like to sort of ask the question. One of my favorite authors is a guy named Francois de la Rochefoucauld, whom some of you may have read. He was a French writer who hung around the court of Louis XIV and watched the people in the court and made observations which he wrote down, many of which strike me as surprisingly modern. So one of the comments that he made was that hypocrisy is the homage which vice pays to virtue. Well, it strikes me in the first place that that is kind of the underlying motivation of a lot of what goes on in political campaigns. But maybe it's the underlying motivation of what goes on when mathematicians talk about a topic like this. Mathematicians, for better or worse, tend to be rather precise about their definitions. They don't tend to claim any truth about them. They just want to know what they're talking about rather precisely. And so I've noticed that in earlier talks here that I came to as well, people gave definitions, possibly not of the degree of exactness that mathematicians might, but nonetheless made an attempt in this direction. And so I want to do the same thing about modern society. What do I mean by modern society and the question of whether it can survive? I'm thinking in the sort of general way of the carefree life that we all lead. For instance, we're pretty much able to have whatever ideas we like and do what we like. Those of you who have been here for a couple of years will know, for instance, that the local senator was rather unhappy with a play which was being offered here a few years ago, and despite all the objections, people went ahead and did it, and nobody cared. We also have the ability to travel quite freely. I mean, inside the US, after all, you can travel almost completely anonymously, or at least pretty close. And you can even travel quite freely around the world. But the trends are not optimistic on that score. I also think that modern society implies that you can have a sort of private life and do what you like, associate with the people you like. And at the same time, if you don't choose to do that, you can associate as widely as you like. Even Mr. Obama is discovering things like that. So what I mean is here, very broadly, you can have whatever ideas you like, and nobody's going to bother you. And it's that sort of thing that I wonder whether we are actually going to manage to preserve. One of the sort of things that I've learned, for better or worse, in the time I've been around is that the long term does actually arrive eventually. And so no one, for instance, probably could have predicted very exactly the recent financial crisis. But as you look back at it, it's pretty clear that there was a policy, for instance, of rewarding borrowing and not rewarding savings. And for many years, there has been grumbling in the US that, in particular, my generation, and probably your generation also, didn't save enough and spent too much. But it seemed like a good idea at the time. And no one paid much attention to the fact that in the long run, maybe this wasn't completely sustainable. Of course, it happens in other places. If you've seen the news, you know that there has just been a fairly large earthquake in Pakistan in which at least some dozens of people were killed. Of course, what's going on there is that under the surface, forces are slowly building. The forces are there whether you like them or not. Nobody knows exactly when they're going to be released or what the consequences will be, but the long term does arise. And of course, there are lots of jokes about California disappearing into the Pacific and that sort of thing. These forces affect life in other ways, some of which are maybe not so obvious. And I'd like here and a number of times during this talk to kind of give you a few personal anecdotes, which I hope sort of illustrate the point. When I started graduate school in England, it so happened that one of the people who was there as a visiting professor that year was a man named Saunders McLain. Now, the mathematicians in this room will all know who Saunders McLain was. He was clearly, was and remains one of the most distinguished American mathematicians of the 20th century. But McLain's history was that he was one of the first group of American mathematicians who migrated to Europe for their training after World War I. Now, of course, it was after World War I that the US started to emerge as something of an international power. At that stage, if you wanted to study with the best, you kind of had to go where the best were. And there were not that many places in the world, one of them being Göttingen, which at that stage in Germany had more than half a century of being one of the best in the world. And of course, there were Cambridge and Oxford and Paris and places like that. McLain was asked to give a talk. He was at that stage near the end of his formal career. Was asked to give a talk about the changes that he had seen in mathematics over his life. And I've never quite forgotten the diagram that he drew in one of the things he said, which was that at the time that he was studying, the mathematicians were pretty much geographically based. And so if someone like him wanted to study at the highest end, what he had to do was to go where those people were. And it so happened they were in a small town in Germany, still there, still has its university, perhaps not as famous as it was then. But during the course of his career, the subjects that mathematicians were interested in had kind of divided up into what he called virtual colleges. He was, of course, giving this talk in a college in England, so that perhaps was a bit of a reference there. And what he meant by that was that academic disciplines have split up, and instead of having lots of people in one place who are interested in those things, what you have is one or two faculty members at each of 20 or 30 universities around the world, and they themselves essentially represent the university about that subject. Well, here's where I get to plead my ignorance in anthropology, but it wouldn't surprise me if much the same happens in most any specialized subject these days. That occasionally there are conferences where people get together, but fundamentally it's the technology which has meant that instead of having a geographically based environment, we now have a kind of an intellectually based one, very thin but very widely dispersed. So this obviously wasn't going to happen without something like the internet, certainly not to the scale that it has happened. And so it's a case where computers, in an underlying way, have caused a change in the large-scale behavior, which in retrospect probably looks fairly obvious, but I think at the time, maybe nobody predicted was going to happen. So computers have here and in many other places often had kind of significant catalytic role, often positive, but sometimes not so positive. And that's really what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes here. There are really three areas which I've selected to discuss. At the time I originally proposed this talk a couple of years ago, obviously, lots of things hadn't happened, which have happened in the meantime. But fortunately, the topic is general enough that that's not really an issue. The first one I'd like to talk about is the change in business and commerce generally. And I'm using a kind of traditional definition of commerce here. What, of course, has happened is that commerce has been sped up with social implications that one might not have expected at the time. If you know a bit of business history, for instance, you'll know that huge amounts of money were spent building canals, some of which actually got as far as Fort Wayne, but their timing was really bad. Because within a handful of years after the completion of these canals, the railroads were invented and became practical. And so the canals were wiped out, because as much as the canals were hugely better at transporting large amounts of materials, they were slow. And so the railroad simply destroyed the canals and the people who backed them and left us with a different environment. Lots more things happened at the same time. Without things like railroads for fast transportation, lots of things had to be produced and distributed locally because things couldn't be preserved indefinitely. It was the railroads, for instance, with the ability to put chopped meat on ice that meant that you didn't need to have a butcher in every neighborhood anymore because you could butcher things in large areas, in large quantities, and ship them around. And so there came to be serious changes in the structure of the way business operated. Another curious phenomenon of technology is, if you look at any city, Fort Wayne is as good an example as any, you will find just outside the downtown area a rather nice looking but typically somewhat rundown residential area. I mean, we've got one, so do most cities. Of course, what happened there is much the same thing. That really nice area was really nice when it was a reasonable commute from downtown by horse or carriage out to there. And with the advance in technology, suddenly it became easy for everyone to get there. Suddenly it became a less status-laden notion, and the places you went to became farther out. So the result of the technology is that things like city themselves became reorganized. And we probably weren't, well, not we, but the people who invented the technology in the first place probably weren't thinking of that kind of reorganization of society. What computers have done is to take this same issue and make it much, much worse. You've probably seen figures, for instance, that as of approximately 100 years ago, a substantial proportion of the American population was still involved in the process of producing enough food for everybody to eat. I understand that in medieval times, it tended to take something like 9 people to produce enough food for 10 people to eat, and the amount left over is obviously not much. In the US at this stage, the proportion of the population which is actually engaged in farming is only several percent. There's been similar sorts of productivity gains in other areas. Now, back when I was in grade school, it's hard saying why one remembers things that one remembers, but I do remember this one. I remember reading an article which said roughly that we're going to have all these wonderful gains in how we can produce things, and the result is that we're going to have so much wealth that the problem will be how to deal with all our spare time. Well, of course, with a generation of experience, we know that there was a consequence that wasn't foreseen. The issue was, if you can produce lots of stuff cheaply, the problem is not actually producing things, but getting people to buy yours rather than somebody else's. Because if you produce cheaply and yours isn't the one that gets bought, you don't really have very much recourse. And if you look now at the cost of a loaf of bread and what's involved, you've probably seen analyses like this because they appear in popular magazines every once in a while. What's happened is that the actual amount of money going to the people who make the bread is substantially less than the amount of money going to people who design the packaging and ship it around and do all of the peripheral things that are necessary to actually get you to buy it. So this is a case where we've kind of done it to ourselves. we've used the technology, and an unexpected effect has been that we've created a very unstable economic environment around it. Because you don't have to buy from your local bread maker, you can buy from anyone, and you can switch on a dime if you choose to. So we've gone from a relatively stable supply situation to one that's highly unpredictable. Things are now being shown to be clearly more unstable than we thought in other areas. For instance, if you do buy a loaf of bread, or for that matter, a train ticket or something like that, it's pretty clear what you've got. It's also now pretty clear in what was going on in the financial markets that nobody really had too much idea what was underlying this stuff. If you start out and have a mortgage, in principle, it means a certain amount of money coming in, and in exchange for giving somebody that money, you take a cash flow stream in the long run. But what the banks did was not only to lump these things together so that you kind of had larger scale, but then to slice and dice them in very peculiar ways. For instance, they would do things like take the top 20% in terms of value and say roughly, for all of the money that's coming in here, you get 20% at a relatively low interest rate because you're high on the scale. And of the money coming in, you people get a much higher interest rate on the investment, but you're the last people to get your money. So if the money actually doesn't come in for some reason, you're the first ones to suffer in exchange for the greater risk. Well, if this happened once, you might even believe it, but it actually happened in several layerings. And it's now clear that these models had lots of assumptions underneath them, which in retrospect are somewhat dodgy. One of which was, we're the only people who are thinking that way. At least we are thinking that way, and there's a big market that's not thinking that way. And it's now pretty clear that since these people all knew each other, many of whom were actually PhD mathematicians, I'm sorry to say, what happened was that there was this very unstable environment because it wasn't clear what was underlying it all. And nonetheless, huge amounts of money sloshing around, which could come and, as it's turned out, can go. So in terms of commerce, we have this enormous speed up in process and, of course, enormous increase in scale and enormous change in terms of where the value actually is in a way which is much harder to define, consequently much less stable. And you probably know, for instance, that the country of Iceland looks very much like going broke. Iceland is actually quite a nice country, which I visited once upon a time. It has a population about the same as Fort Wayne. What happened was that the Icelanders some years ago moved from the notion of lots of fishing to running international banks, which was probably nicer than going out in storms, and led to people being able to wear nice suits and that sort of thing. So the Icelanders started offering relatively high interest rates on banks and attracting capital from Europe, which worked fine as long as it worked until people wanted to take money out. So I said the population of Iceland is about the same as the population of Fort Wayne. In order to prevent itself from collapsing in the face of these cash withdrawals, the Icelanders have recently had to borrow $4 billion. If you divide by the number of people around, you get something that looks pretty close to not sustainable if you have to sustain it on the fishing industry. Well, Iceland is a kind of small, unhappy case, but it's not completely clear to me that we're not setting ourselves up on a larger scale for such problems as well. And the US position is more stable than Iceland's, but the trend is maybe not what one would have liked. Secondary. One of the things that I think constitutes modern society is the ability to have a reasonable amount of freedom to be as eccentric as you would like to be. Now, you can wear a tie, you cannot wear a tie, you can do whatever you like. But it's clear that computers and technology are making that a lot harder to manage than it used to be. Of course, the archetypal vision of this is the scene in George Orwell's 1984 with two-directional TV sets which are keeping an eye on what people are doing. Not only has that come to pass, the situation is much worse than Orwell might ever have thought. In the UK at this moment, and they're the people who seem to have pushed farthest on this front, There are now around 4 million cameras on the street monitoring what's going on. Well, the population of the UK is around 60 million or something like that. So that says that there is 1 camera for every 15 people in the whole country. Well, there are lots of good things about that. For instance, when there were the bombings a few years ago, the British were able to trace this quite effectively. People put bombs on the subways, and by simply following from one camera to another, they were actually able to trace the paths of the people who were involved. Another case that would be really hard to argue against was also a British case a couple years before that, when there was a young woman, as I recall around 12 or something like that, who was in foster care and had a reputation for being a bit reckless. She was out with her foster mother shopping, and the mother sort of stepped into a store for a moment or something like that, and the girl bolted. And a 12-year-old can go fairly quickly when they want to. So obviously there was a big effort to try to find this girl. What they did was to start checking the cameras. They were able to trace her track to get her to one of the London train stations. From there, they knew what trains were departing. So they checked the cameras in all the places where those trains arrived. They were able to find images of her getting off the train at a certain station. So at that stage, they had her located down to a relatively small town out in the West Country, and they found her. So nobody would argue against the effort to take care of people like that, but it seems clear that that same technology could be used in other ways, shall we say. What have people tried to do about this kind of thing? Well, one of the best known examples is a software program called PGP. Stands for Pretty Good Privacy. Some of you may actually use this thing. It's an open source program that uses very high quality encryption. And you need only to, if you want to deal with people elsewhere and not have your messages read, download this thing, register a PGP key, send it to somehow or other to the other person, and once this key has been shared in a suitable way, then your communications will be out of reach of nearly everyone. The use of this piece of software is illegal in much of the world. There is actually a website that you can go to. I put the reference on here, netaction.org, encrypt/legality HTML. You can look up your country and see whether you are actually committing a crime by using this piece of software. The privacy issue goes much, much farther than even that. For instance, there is in the US a prohibition against self-incrimination. Well, it's not quite clear to me where you draw the line on things like that. One might think, for instance, about a lie detector. Now, is there self-incrimination involved in that? Is it okay if people are asked, basically said, are you willing to take this test in order to show your innocence? And people have the option about dealing with it. But there was a case last June in Pune. Let me read you the description. It was discussed fairly widely on the net, but what I've taken is actually from the New York Times last September. India has become the first country to convict someone of a crime relying on evidence from a brain scanner that produces images of the human mind in action and is said to reveal signs that a suspect remembers details of the crime in question. The issue here was a young Indian woman who was engaged possibly in a traditional arranged way, decided she didn't like it, ran off with someone else, came back later, made an arrangement with her ex to meet at a restaurant, and her ex soon thereafter died of poison. And so the young woman was accused basically of having put arsenic in the tea of this man. The issue here is, well, let me read the rest of the article. So that kind of sets the background. For years, scientists have peered into the brain and sought to identify deception. They've shot infrared beams through liars' heads and placed them in giant magnetic resonance imaging machines and used cameras to track their eyeballs, scanners to track their eyeballs. The technologies are generally regarded as promising, ... In June, in Pune, a judge explicitly cited a scan as proof that a suspect's brain held experiential knowledge about the crime that only the killer could possess, sentencing her to life in prison. Law enforcement officials in several countries, including Israel and Singapore, have showed interest in the technology and have visited government labs that use it in interrogations, Indian officials said. Henry Greeley, a bioethicist at Stanford Law School, wrote in the American Journal of Law that if such scans are adopted, the legal issues alone are enormous, ... What happened here was basically that the woman had to do nothing. She simply sat there quietly while the prosecutors read a description of the crime. The machine basically monitored her brain waves and came to the conclusion that she knew about that scene rather than didn't know about that scene. And on that basis, she was convicted. Now, that's a long ways from two-way TV. How comfortable would you be with the notion that people don't even have to ask you questions? They just ask you to sit down and be quiet, please, for a few minutes while we read some things to you. And on that basis, legal testimony is generated. So I thought, well, you know, this probably isn't happening all over the world because lots of people wouldn't like it. Then I discovered there's a firm out in California trying to popularize it in this country as well. Okay. How am I doing for time here? Fine. The third area, oh, by the way, in terms of privacy, it probably goes without saying that you cannot at this stage send an email or have a cell phone conversation that's not tracked. And anyone who doubts this might look at this recent incident only a couple of days ago where this pair of teenagers in Tennessee were basically picked up for planning basically racially motivated rampage. So the question to ask yourself is, when two teenagers in Tennessee are talking about things on the internet, how is it that they can track everything so quickly? I mean, it's one thing if somebody's on your suspect list for years. It's another thing when you have two people who, as far as I can tell, irrespective of how horrible what they were thinking about was, didn't have any criminal record at all. They were legally, as far as I can tell, no different than any of us in this room. Okay, so computers are once again kind of doing it to us. Let's think then a little bit about the situation of physical security. Lots of things are converging in ways which also I think are kind of unpleasant and the long term might eventually arrive. What I want to do is to cite several things here which clearly on their own nobody would ever object to. The first one is that education on an international basis is becoming much more widespread than it used to be. There are students traipsing around the world, and in spite of the difficulties of getting visas to get into the US these days, the total number of students traveling around the world is generally increasing. And at the same time we're educating normal people, of course, some proportion of those people somewhere probably don't wish well to various other people. Secondly, international travel is getting easier, notwithstanding the trouble getting across the US border these days. And so it's easy for people who may have unhappy intentions to travel fairly easily. I mean, you can still walk across the US-Canadian border in lots of places. The third issue is that technology is making lots of nice things smaller. For instance, the cell phones in this room and the toy that my wife bought yesterday for $300 that runs Linux, and she was hooking up to the network. But it's also making unpleasant technology smaller, both in the way of the ability to scan things and the ability to, for instance, build detonators and such like. And I'm sure you all know, for instance, that the standard way of setting off bombs these days is to have small detonators and basically call the detonator on a cell phone. And, of course, if that doesn't work, it can be a bit embarrassing, but nonetheless. That's happened too, of course. And the fourth phenomenon here is that the world's clearly getting richer. Once again, notwithstanding what's happened in the last few months, there are huge amounts of money which are sloshing around the world. And some of that money seems to be finding its way into unpleasant hands. Let me give you another quotation here which has several aspects of the subject. Once again, this one happens to be from the Times, which the university is so nice to provide us, from last September. When Rachel Ehrenfield wrote Funding Evil, How Terrorism is Financed, she was in the United States. The book was never published in Britain, but 23 copies were sold online. A wealthy Saudi businessman named in the article She accused in the book of being a financer of terrorism. And he sued her in Britain, where libel laws, as you may know, are somewhat easier than they are here. Mrs. Ehrenfield decided not to defend the suit in Britain, and the plaintiff won a default judgment for a sizable amount of money because there was no one there saying the plaintiff wasn't right. The plaintiff is now free to sue in the United States to collect the judgment. He demanded a significant contribution to a charity of his choice, a charity Mrs. Ehrenfield said she feared would be one with ties to terrorism. The upshot is a First Amendment loophole in the internet age. Almost every American book can be bought in Britain, and that means American authors are subject to being sued under British libel law. At the same time, elsewhere in the same issue, we have this. There's a story about a suit in the United States regarding a suitcase containing $800,000 US, which seems to have been provided by the president of Venezuela, Mr. Chavez, to an Argentine electoral candidate. The holder was bent and wired. The resulting conversation and transcript seemed to contradict directly Chavez's denial that he had anything to do with this. So a suit has been started in the US about this matter, which was fundamentally a South American matter. So what can we do about the physical security issue? Well, obviously not really very clear. Our airports are a mess. I don't know how many of us actually feel that much more secure about the situation that we used to. Let me go a little bit farther in terms of physical security with one more quotation. This one taken from last week from the BBC reporting, October 23rd. But about the US. I just didn't find anything about it in the US. Scientists at the Medical College of Georgia say they have found a molecular mechanism that can rapidly remove specific memories. In experiments with mice, researchers were able to eliminate memories without any damage to the rodents' brains. The technique, which works on a particular protein, in the brain. Scientists say that in the long term, it would be possible to develop a pill that wipes out traumatic and fearful memories in humans. Dr. George Tsien of the Brain and Behavior Discovery Institute in Georgia said, first of all, I should emphasize the methodology is not applicable to the human clinical situation yet. So, what's the physical security situation like when you only have to sit there quietly and people can decide what you think, and medical techniques exist to eradicate memories, even if it's not ready for human clinical use yet? I would like, so let me talk in conclusion, if I can find the page on which my conclusion is here, about various things. The issue is that now, as always, the developments that happen tend to have both good and bad sides. And on one hand, one probably shouldn't be too pessimistic about this sort of thing. After all, there's no question that I personally have suffered very little in my life. I've had the pleasure of traveling a lot, living around the world a lot. I've only been hassled once or twice. Oh, well, it's kind of an antidote to some of the other pessimism I'll tell you about. Once when I was hassled, I was flying at the time from Canada to Malaysia, and I'd never been in Taiwan. I had to overnight somewhere, so I thought, okay, what the heck, I'll stay overnight in Taiwan and see what the place is like. So I showed up in Taiwan, and the man kind of looked at my passport and looked at my passport, and after a while said, where's my visa? Well, I didn't have a visa because I had never dawned on me that you couldn't just pick up a transit visa in the airport when you're only on your way. The only reason I was staying was that there wasn't a flight out that I could take until the next morning, and so I thought I would go out to the hotel and wander around. Turns out that wasn't true. So I found myself probably technically arrested, but the poor customs official, I think, was really quite embarrassed about this all. I mean, I had a forward ticket. It was pretty obvious that I wasn't trained to do anything. I volunteered to stay in the airport. And because after all, if I never went out of the airport, I would never have gone through immigration, so I'd never be in the country, so I shouldn't need a visa. And he very apologetically said he was sorry he couldn't do that. So they kind of threw me in a wagon with a van full of what I take it were illegal immigrant workers, took me off to the hotel, which turned out to be the same one I had a reservation in anyway. So I went up, kind of put my suitcase down in the room, went downstairs, intending to walk around the hotel just as I had before, only to discover that they had a guard posted at the door to make sure that I didn't go out the front door. Well, so I chatted with the guard. I was quite good-natured. He actually spoke a little bit of English, and alas, I couldn't go out and set foot on Taiwanese soil. So if that's the worst that happens to any of us, obviously we aren't in a position to complain very much. But I do have this sense about the long-term, sometimes not being too optimistic. Let me read from you a very small quotation from Abraham Lincoln, which in a sense I think sums up the conundrum that we're often facing here. Lincoln said, "The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep was a black one. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of the word liberty, and precisely the same difference prevails today among us human creatures." In a sense, these are not my problems. I think that it was Louis XV who was credited for saying, "After me, the deluge," and of course, in his case, it was sort of prescient since after him really was the deluge. My suspicion is that it will probably last as long as I do. But the question is what will happen over the careers of those of you who are undergraduates now. I don't know any way to solve the problems that I'm talking about. What I'd like to do is to encourage people to think about these. There is a well-known joke among a certain kind of international traveler that in Britain, the only thing that people really get enthused about is the past. And in the US, the only thing people really get enthused about is the present. And in Japan, the only thing that people really get enthused about is the future. And while I'm sure that's overly simplified, in some respects, I think it contains a grain of truth. And what we need to do in areas like I've mentioned here is to give some thought to the long-term consequences so that we can actually have the benefits of these things without having the unpleasant sides. And I don't know how to do it, but like I said, it's not my problem, it's yours. So with that, I will be glad to take any questions anyone might. No guarantees to answer them, of course, because I probably don't have any very good answers.
Just a bit more of an observation regarding international travel. I have a stepbrother who he's a techno DJ, and in any case, he's not an anarchist himself, but he performs weekly on an anarchist radio program in California, or at least used to. And when he tried to travel to Canada, he was blocked from traveling because of his associations with anarchists who are now internationally prevented from showing up because of their activities at G8 meetings and things of that sort. And so I don't necessarily share the notion that international travel is as easy or becoming easier. I think computers have actually made it a bit more difficult.
Yeah, well, I think they have.
Are picked out and identified.
And one of the issues here is that there are all of these big lists whose goal is basically to pick out the bad guys. But lists are notoriously inaccurate, and big lists assembled from somewhat unknown sources are probably even more notoriously inaccurate. But of course, it's computers that make it possible to do that. So it's yet another case of these side effects that people didn't intend and probably wouldn't want to give up the good side, but have to recognize that there is an unpleasant side as well.
I was actually watching a television show not too long ago, and this teenage girl was on there and was talking about these stalkers that were kind of chasing after her and her friends, but they were using their cell phones to find them and pretty much harass them and everything by like hacking through and using the microphones in the cell phone to pick up conversations within their small group, and then the camera part of their phone to take pictures of them, and then they would text them back saying, "Man, I really wish I had like the same yellow shirt as you have on," or something like that, and like would stalk them through their cell phones.
Yeah, I mean, that's another example of that kind of thing. And presumably most everybody in an audience like this has looked on Google Earth and kind of had a look at the building that you live in, can sort of see what time of day the photo was taken and whether it's your car that's in the driveway or in the parking space. And they're now trying to set that up with real-time analysis, so that if, for instance, a vehicle moves in the neighborhood of a building, that can be reported back.
I've been told that these cable boxes and these DVD boxes that they're putting in, you have to have them or you won't be able to get regular TV. How easy is it for them to put cameras in there and see everything you got going on?
I think not easy at all.
I don't know. I've had some people say they've had clickers in their boxes.
Well, I don't know the circumstance behind. I mean, the truth is that there are really good, really small cameras these days. One of the amusing things you can do online, there are people who love to build really, really fancy model trains. And you put a TV camera in your model train and get the sense of being an engineer. The lenses on the things are only a millimeter or so in diameter. I think at this stage there probably are not cameras in any consumer device unless you want one, I mean in your laptop or something like that. On the other hand, the prospect of embedding tracking equipment is certainly possible and going to be hard to resist.
One thing I was going to say about the cable boxes, if you have satellite TV or Comcast or Verizon, what they're now doing is it will collect information on what channels you're watching and then target specific commercials. So you might be watching a football game or a baseball game or a soap opera, whatever the case might be, and the commercial that you see watching that channel may not be the same commercial that I see.
And that's definitely already happening on fairly widely on the internet. If you log on to the internet, the commercials that you see will definitely be targeted, for instance, to the fact that you're sitting in Fort Wayne rather than somewhere else. And possibly other things, depending upon how many efforts you have made to obscure their ability to collect dossier.
I have a camera for my computer that I have not put on my computer for over a year. And that's because I'm not sure if whoever else is using computers other than where they may have a camera, are all those computers shared?
Well, if your computer's not hooked to the internet, then the only way it could possibly
be.
If it's hooked to the internet,
anybody can see whatever else is going on through your camera?
Only if you have the programs running that are actually taking pictures at that moment. So you basically don't have to have that kind of program running any more than any other program if you don't want. And even if you have it running, it will almost certainly have some preferences in that say something about how you want to share it. It's possible to do that. And actually, there's quite an entertaining website which basically trolls the internet looking for web cameras that are on. And so, for instance, if you want to know what's going on, there are cameras at this university that you can log on to the internet and see. There are cameras in the Fort Wayne Library that you can log on and see. There are cameras of the penguins at the North Pole that you can log on and see. But those are all cases where people have intentionally put the cameras on the network for one reason or another. And if you don't, then I think for the time being it's not going to happen, but I wouldn't want to bet forever.
Well, there was the instance, I think it was last year, of somebody who had a Macintosh laptop with a built-in camera. Somebody stole the laptop, and that person was able to remotely activate their camera and find out who had stolen it.
Actually, there have been several nice instances of things like that where people, well, I mean, that's one case. Other cases where laptops were basically calling home occasionally for backup or other purposes. And so you kind of track where this thing was, and people gradually managed to pin down the location exactly and then go to the local police authorities and with kind of reasonable cause. It's sort of nice when things like that work. They probably don't work as often as I'd like, but it sort of shows that not all the instincts here are bad, and sometimes not all the accidents are bad. Anything else, or time for more pizza?
Dr. Erbach, thank you very much.